My name is Olivia Carter, and 5 years ago, I thought I had my whole life figured out. I was 35 years old, working as an architect for one of the largest firms in Chicago. I had just been promoted to senior project manager. I was engaged to a wonderful man named Mark, and for the first time in years, it finally felt like everything was falling into place. My two older brothers, Brian and Eric, liked to tease me by saying I was our parents' favorite. I always laughed. The truth was much simpler. I was just the one who answered the phone. My mother, Helen, had always been the heart of our family. Every Sunday, she'd invite everyone over for dinner. Somehow, she could convince Brian to stop talking about investments, get Eric to put his phone away, and make Dad laugh so hard he'd nearly spill his coffee. When we were together, everything felt normal. Then Mom was diagnosed with cancer. At first, the doctors were optimistic. Surgery. Chemotherapy. Radiation. One treatment after another. We all believed she'd beat it. She always had. But after nearly a year of fighting, the doctors sat us down and quietly explained there was nothing more they could do. The day before she passed away, she asked the nurse to leave the room. Then she looked at me. Not at Brian. Not at Eric. At me. She reached for my hand with what little strength she had left. Olivia. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. I need you to promise me something. I nodded immediately. Anything. She glanced toward the hallway where Dad was sitting alone, staring at the floor. He hadn't left her side in months. When I'm gone. She paused to catch her breath. Don't let your father grow old alone. I felt tears running down my face before I even answered. I promise. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Just enough to let me know she'd heard me. Those were the last words my mother ever said to me. For a while, I believed keeping that promise would be easy. I thought it meant visiting Dad more often. Calling him every evening. Helping him around the house whenever something broke. I had no idea that promise would eventually cost me my career. My relationship. My savings. And nearly every dream I'd spent years working toward. Because almost 2 years after we buried Mom. My phone rang at 4:17 on a cold Tuesday morning. Hospitals never call at 4 in the morning with good news. The doctor only said one sentence. Your father has suffered a major stroke. You need to come now. I grabbed my keys without even changing out of my pajamas. As I drove through the empty streets, one thought kept running through my mind. Please let him still be alive. I had no idea. That before the sun came up. My brothers would ask me to sacrifice everything. And they would never make the same sacrifice themselves. By the time I reached St. Mary's Medical Center, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely sign my name at the reception desk. A nurse led me down a long, silent hallway to the intensive care unit. Dad looked smaller. Machines surrounded his bed, filling the room with a constant rhythm of beeps and soft mechanical hums. His eyes were open, but they seemed distant, as if he was trying to understand where he was. When he saw me, he tried to smile. The right side of his face barely moved. Hi, Dad, I whispered, forcing myself to sound stronger than I felt. He slowly reached for my hand. His fingers were cold. I'm here, I said. You're going to be okay. I wasn't sure whether I was trying to comfort him. Or myself. About 40 minutes later, Brian walked into the room wearing an expensive navy blue suit, still talking on his Bluetooth headset. He nodded at me before finishing his phone call in the hallway. Eric arrived shortly after, carrying a paper cup of coffee like he'd stopped somewhere on the way. Neither of them looked scared. Neither of them cried. The doctor introduced himself and invited us into a private consultation room. He didn't waste time. The stroke was severe, he explained, placing several brain scans on the table. We were able to stabilize Mr. Carter, but his recovery will take a long time. How long? Brian asked. The doctor hesitated. Months, possibly years. Silence filled the room. He'll need daily assistance, the doctor continued. Medication management, physical therapy, transportation, meal preparation, and someone to stay with him for most of the day. No one said a word. Brian leaned back in his chair. Eric looked down at the floor. I already knew what was coming. Brian cleared his throat. I wish I could help more. I almost laughed. He hadn't even been asked yet. My job has me traveling almost every week, he continued. If I disappear for months, I'll lose clients. Eric nodded immediately. My dealership is expanding. I've got 30 employees depending on me. Then both of them looked at me. Not at Dad. At me. Brian spoke carefully, almost like he'd rehearsed it. Liv, you work remotely sometimes. I work in the office 4 days a week, I answered. Still. He shrugged. You're not married yet. Eric added, and you've always been closer to Dad. That sentence hit me harder than either of them realized. Not because it was true. But because they were using love as an excuse. I stared at both of them. So, that's it? Brian sighed. We're just being realistic. No, I replied quietly. You're being convenient. Neither of them argued. Because they knew I was right. Back in Dad's room, he looked from one face to another. He couldn't speak clearly yet, but he understood enough. His eyes stopped on me. There was guilt in them. He knew exactly what my brothers were asking. And he hated himself for it. That evening, before leaving the hospital, Brian put a hand on my shoulder. You've always been the strongest one. Eric smiled. We'll help however we can. At the time, I wanted to believe them. I had no idea those 6 words would become the biggest lie either of my brothers had ever told. The first month after Dad came home was the hardest. Not because of the physical work. Because of the silence. Our house used to be full of laughter. Mom always had music playing while she cooked dinner, Dad would whistle while fixing something in the garage, and every Sunday the kitchen was packed with family. Now, the only sounds were Dad's walker scraping across the hardwood floor and the alarm reminding me it was time for another dose of medication. Every day followed the same routine. I'd wake up before sunrise to help Dad get dressed. Make breakfast. Check his blood pressure. Drive him to physical therapy. Help him back into bed. Cook dinner. Clean the house. Do laundry. Then, when Dad finally fell asleep, I'd open my laptop and try to catch up on work until 2 or 3 in the morning. For a few weeks, I convinced myself I could handle both. I was wrong. One afternoon, my manager called. Olivia, do you have a minute? I already knew where the conversation was going. I've noticed you've been missing meetings, she said gently. I know. Clients are asking why you're unavailable. I know. You've submitted 3 projects late. I closed my eyes. I know. She let out a quiet sigh. We really value you. That's why we're offering you a 3-month unpaid leave instead of replacing you. 3 months. It sounded generous. Until I remembered what Dad's neurologist had told us. Recovery wasn't measured in months. It could take years. The next morning, I stared at my resignation letter for almost 20 minutes before pressing send. 12 years. Gone with a single click. When I told Dad that evening, he looked devastated. You quit? I'll find another job later. He shook his head. No. Because of me. I knelt beside his chair. No, Dad. I smiled, even though my eyes were burning. Because we're family. He turned away, pretending to watch television. But I noticed him wiping away a tear. Brian called 2 days later. How's Dad? About the same. Good, good. There was an awkward pause. Then he asked. So, are you still working? I told him I'd resigned. He was quiet for a moment. Wow. That was it. Not, are you okay? Not, how are you paying your bills? Just, wow. Eric's reaction wasn't much better. You actually quit? Yes. Damn. Another pause. I guess someone's gotta do it. Someone. Not him. Not Brian. Someone. Weeks turned into months. My savings slowly disappeared. The wedding Mark and I had spent over a year planning was postponed. Then postponed again. One evening, he came over carrying takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. At first, I thought he was trying to cheer me up. Instead, he sat across from me at the kitchen table and stared at his hands. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I felt my stomach tighten. Do what? This. He looked around the house. Waiting. I didn't answer. He continued quietly. Every plan we make gets cancelled. I know. You never leave the house unless it's for your dad. I know. I miss us, Olivia. So do I. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I'd been afraid of for months. When does your life start again? I looked toward the living room. Dad was asleep in his chair, still holding the old photo of Mom that he carried almost everywhere. I whispered the only honest answer I had. I don't know. Mark nodded slowly. But the look in his eyes told me something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing my career anymore. I was afraid I was about to lose everything else too. 3 months after I quit my job, my entire world had shrunk to the size of our little house. I barely saw my friends anymore. I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone to a movie or even had dinner at a restaurant. Every day revolved around Dad. Some mornings were encouraging. He'd manage to button his own shirt or walk a few extra steps without losing his balance. Other days, he couldn't even hold a spoon. Whenever he got frustrated, he'd apologize. I'm sorry. He said it so often that eventually I stopped answering. Instead, I'd smile, pick up the spoon, and continue feeding him like it was the most normal thing in the world. Because to me, it had become normal. Brian and Eric, on the other hand, had perfected a different routine. They'd disappear for weeks. Sometimes months. Then, out of nowhere, they'd show up together. Never on a random Tuesday. Never when Dad had physical therapy. Never when he needed help getting to the bathroom. Always. When someone else was around. One Sunday, our Aunt Susan and Uncle Frank came to visit. Less than 20 minutes after they arrived, Brian's black Mercedes pulled into the driveway. 5 minutes later, Eric's SUV followed. What incredible timing. Brian walked in carrying an expensive fruit basket. Eric brought a fancy bakery box filled with pastries. Anyone walking into the house would have thought they were the world's most devoted sons. Dad smiled when he saw them. Despite everything, he was always happy when his boys came home. For the next hour, they laughed with him, asked about his therapy, and told funny stories from work. Aunt Susan looked at me and whispered, "You must be so grateful your brothers help so much." I forced a smile. If only she knew. After lunch, Dad quietly asked Brian, "Would you play chess?" Brian checked the time on his watch. "I wish I could, Dad." He stood up. "I've got another meeting." Eric glanced at his phone. "Me too." Dad's smile faded for just a second. It was so quick that I don't think anyone else noticed. But I did. I always did. Within 5 minutes. They were gone. The fruit basket stayed. The pastries stayed. Their father stayed. I stood at the front window, watching their cars disappear down the street. Dad slowly rolled his wheelchair beside me. You know. His words came slowly now, but they were becoming clearer every week. When they were little. He smiled faintly. Brian always wanted to be just like me. I swallowed the lump in my throat. And Eric? Dad chuckled softly. He never left my side. Neither of us said anything after that. Some memories are too painful to compare with reality. That night, while Dad was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table sorting through the stack of unpaid bills. Mortgage. Utilities. Medical equipment. Prescription costs. Physical therapy. I quietly moved money from one account to another, trying to make everything last just one more month. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Brian. Quick question. Has Dad ever mentioned updating his will? I stared at the screen. No greeting. No how's Dad? No how are you holding up? Just the will. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to answer. Because for the first time, a terrible thought crossed my mind. Maybe my brothers weren't waiting for Dad to recover. Maybe they were waiting for something else. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking Brian's text. Maybe it was an innocent question. Maybe he was just trying to get our father's affairs in order. Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few weeks, the messages kept coming. Does Dad still own the lake house? Did he ever sell Grandpa's watch collection? Is the mortgage on the house paid off? Not once did either of my brothers ask how Dad was feeling. Not once did they ask if I needed a break. It was always about what he had. Never about who he was. One Friday afternoon, Dad had a physical therapy appointment across town. Afterward, he looked exhausted. Can we stop for ice cream? He asked with a shy smile. I laughed. The doctor would probably say no. He smiled back. But I pulled into a small ice cream shop anyway. We sat outside in the warm afternoon sun, eating vanilla cones like nothing in the world was wrong. For 20 minutes. He wasn't a stroke patient. He was just my dad. On the drive home, he quietly said, "Thank you." For what? For treating me like I'm still me. I had to blink away tears before answering. You'll always be you, Dad. That evening, Dad fell asleep early. I realized we'd run out of one of his medications, so I drove to the pharmacy just before closing. When I got back, I noticed two unfamiliar cars parked in front of the house. Brian's. And Eric's. The lights in the kitchen were on. I smiled. Maybe they'd finally come to spend time with Dad. Maybe I had judged them too harshly. I quietly unlocked the front door. Before I stepped inside, I heard Brian's voice. The house alone has to be worth over $1 million. I froze. Eric laughed. If Dad leaves everything equally, that's not bad. Brian lowered his voice. He'd better not let Olivia guilt him into changing anything. I couldn't move. My hand was still on the doorknob. Eric answered. Relax. Dad's old school. He'd never cut his sons out. Brian chuckled. Besides, she's already sacrificing everything. She'll probably be too exhausted to fight us over a few dollars. A few dollars. I had given up my career. My savings. My relationship was hanging by a thread. I hadn't slept through the night in almost a year. And to them, it was worth a few dollars. I stood there, unable to breathe. Then I heard another sound. A slow creak. Dad's bedroom door. The hallway had gone completely silent. Neither Brian nor Eric realized it. But Dad had heard every single word. I looked toward the hallway just in time to see him standing there, one hand gripping his walker. His face wasn't angry. It was something much worse. Heartbroken. Brian turned around first. Dad. No one spoke. The silence felt endless. Finally, Dad looked at all three of us. Then his eyes settled on me. In a quiet, trembling voice, he said, "Olivia." He took a shaky breath. "Tomorrow. I need you to take me somewhere." He didn't say where. But the look in his eyes told me one thing. Whatever happened the next day, our family would never be the same again. The next morning, Dad was already dressed when I walked into the kitchen. That alone was unusual. Normally, it took us nearly 40 minutes to get him ready. But somehow, he'd managed to button his shirt by himself. His hands trembled, and the buttons didn't quite line up, but he didn't ask for help. He was determined. When I poured him a cup of coffee, he looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't seen since before the stroke. "Don't tell your brothers." I frowned. "Tell them what?" "Where we're going." I nodded. "I won't." He smiled faintly. "Good." The drive was quiet. I asked him twice where we were headed. Both times he gave me the same answer. "You'll see." About 30 minutes later, I pulled into the parking lot of a small brick office building downtown. The sign outside read, "James Reynolds, attorney at law." I looked at Dad. He slowly nodded. "This is it." I helped him inside. The receptionist greeted him by name, almost as if she had been expecting us. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Reynolds is ready for you." That surprised me. Dad had planned this. James Reynolds looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes. He stood up the moment we entered. "George," he said warmly, shaking Dad's hand. "It's good to see you again." "Again?" I looked back and forth between them. "You've met before?" Dad gave a tiny smile. "A long time ago. James invited us to sit down." Then Dad turned to me. "Olivia." His voice was still slow, but every word was clear. "I'd like a few minutes alone." I hesitated. "You sure?" He nodded. "Please." I had never questioned my father before. I wasn't about to start now. I stepped into the waiting room and quietly closed the door behind me. Nearly an hour passed. Long enough for me to finish 2 cups of coffee and wonder what they could possibly be discussing. Finally, James opened the office door. "Olivia," he said with a gentle smile. "Your father would like you to come back in." Dad looked exhausted. But there was something different about him. For the first time in months, he looked at peace. James placed a thick envelope into a locked drawer of his desk. Then he looked directly at my father. "I'll keep it safe." Dad nodded. "Thank you." As we stood to leave, James shook his hand once more. "I hope we won't need to see each other again for a very long time." Dad smiled sadly. "So do I." The entire drive home, I wanted to ask what had happened. But something told me not to. Dad eventually broke the silence himself. "Olivia." "Yeah?" "I need you to promise me one more thing." I glanced at him. "Anything. If anyone asks." He paused, taking a slow breath. "Don't tell them why we came today." I looked at him for a moment. Then I nodded. "I promise." He reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "I've always trusted you." Those 6 words meant more to me than he could ever know. I didn't realize it then. But while my brothers were busy wondering how much they would inherit, my father had just made the most important decision of his life. And none of them saw it coming. 3 months later, Dad was gone. He passed away quietly in his sleep. I found him just after 6 in the morning, still sitting in his favorite recliner with an old photo of Mom resting on his lap. For a long moment, I couldn't move. It felt impossible that the man who had taught me how to ride a bicycle, who had walked me down every difficult road in life, was suddenly gone. I held his hand until the paramedics arrived. Even after they told me there was nothing they could do. I couldn't let go. Brian and Eric arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. They hugged me. They said all the right things. I'm so sorry. He isn't suffering anymore. We're here for you. I wanted to believe them. I really did. Then Brian looked at his watch. So. He cleared his throat. When are we meeting with the lawyer? I stared at him. Dad hadn't even been gone for an hour. The paperwork hadn't been finished. His body hadn't even left the hospital. And Brian was already thinking about the inheritance. Eric shifted awkwardly beside him. I'm sure Dad kept everything simple, he said. We'll just split it 3 ways and move on. Split it 3 ways. As if Dad's entire life could be reduced to percentages. I didn't answer. Because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure I could stop. The funeral was held 4 days later. More than 100 people came. Former employees. Neighbors. Old friends. Even people I had never met before. One after another, they shared stories about Dad's generosity. How he'd quietly paid for a worker's surgery. How he'd rebuilt a neighbor's porch for free after a storm. How he'd helped struggling families without ever asking for recognition. Listening to them, I realized something. My father had lived a far bigger life than I'd ever known. When the service ended, people surrounded me with hugs and condolences. Brian and Eric stood near the entrance, shaking hands like they were hosting a business event. Then I overheard Brian whisper. Did James call you yet? Eric shook his head. No. He usually schedules the reading within a week. I closed my eyes. They couldn't even wait until after the funeral. 3 days later, my phone rang. Olivia, James Reynolds said. I'd like all 3 of you to come to my office on Friday morning. His tone was calm. Professional. Impossible to read. Friday arrived faster than I expected. Brian walked into the office wearing another tailored suit. Eric smiled confidently as he poured himself a cup of coffee from the waiting area. You nervous? Eric joked. Brian laughed. About what? Dad was fair. Then he looked at me. I hope you're not expecting special treatment just because you lived with him. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid. Because I remembered the promise I'd made in that office months earlier. Don't tell your brothers. James finally opened the conference room door. Please, he said. Come in. The 3 of us took our seats around the large wooden table. A thick sealed envelope rested in front of James. He placed one hand on it before looking at each of us. Your father left very specific instructions. Brian leaned back, smiling. Eric folded his arms. Neither of them noticed the expression on James's face. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't sadness. It was the look of a man who already knew. That within the next few minutes, everything they believed about their future was about to fall apart. No one spoke as James Reynolds carefully broke the seal on the envelope. The room was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. James adjusted his glasses and looked at each of us before beginning. Your father asked me to read this exactly as he wrote it. He unfolded the first page. To my children. If you're hearing this, it means I've already said goodbye. Brian lowered his eyes. Eric leaned back in his chair. I held my breath. James continued. First, I want to thank all 3 of you for the lives you've built. I have always been proud to call you my children. Brian gave me a quick look, almost as if to say, see? I told you everything would be fair. Then James turned the page. His voice became quieter. But being successful in life and being present for your family are not the same thing. Brian's smile disappeared. Eric stopped tapping his fingers on the table. James kept reading. For the last 3 years, I watched my daughter sacrifice everything she had so I would never feel abandoned. She gave up her career, postponed her future, and cared for me every single day without asking for anything in return. I felt tears filling my eyes. Not because of the inheritance. Because my father had noticed. Every difficult morning. Every sleepless night. Every moment I thought no one saw. He had seen all of it. James continued. Brian. Eric. I don't write these words out of anger. I write them out of disappointment. You visited when it was convenient. You called when you needed information. And one evening, you spoke about my property while believing I couldn't hear you. The color drained from both of my brothers' faces. Brian immediately looked toward Eric. Neither of them said a word. You were wrong. I heard every sentence. The room was completely silent. James reached for the final document. Mr. Carter's estate has been distributed according to his wishes. He looked at me first. The family home, the investment accounts, the savings, and Mr. Carter's personal belongings are left to Olivia Carter. Brian shot to his feet. What? James calmly continued. Brian Carter and Eric Carter will each receive $5,000, along with several personal items your father specifically selected for you. This is insane. Brian shouted. He wouldn't do this. Eric slammed both hands on the table. She manipulated him. For the first time since the meeting began. I spoke. No. Both of them turned toward me. He made that decision himself. James slowly opened another envelope. There's one last instruction. He placed 3 handwritten letters on the table. Your father wrote one for each of you. He handed mine to me. I didn't open it. Not yet. Because I already understood something my brothers still didn't. Dad hadn't left me the house because I was his favorite. He left it to me. Because I had never stayed for the house in the first place.